Welcome to Norton from Home. My name is Glenn Tomlinson, and I'm the William Randolph Hearst Curator of Education at the Norton Museum of Art. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program. Part of the Norton Museum of Art's expansion in 2019 included the renovation of houses to support an Artist in Residence program. One of the artists in residence who accepted our offer to participate in the program in its first season in 2020 was Jessica Ingram. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, her residency last spring was cut short. We're delighted that she could make time to join us again this year to complete her residency in West Palm Beach. We're also very excited to have her speak tonight about Road Through Midnight, the result of nearly a decade of research and fieldwork on the part of this artist. Jessica Ingram works with multimedia and archive to explore the ethos of communities and notions of progress and resistance in American culture. Raised in Tennessee, she received her BFA from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and MFA from the California College of the Arts. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Oxford American, Vice, Wired Magazine, and on NPR, and as an official selection at the Sundance Film Festival. Ingram's book, Road Through Midnight, A Civil Rights Memorial, the subject of her talk tonight, and published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2020, was shortlisted for the Paris Photo-Aperture Foundation Book Prize, and was also named a New York Times Best Art Book of 2020. The book is available in the Norton Museum store. If you wish to ask a question during her conversation tonight, please do so in the chat, and Jessica will respond to your questions at the conclusion of her talk. Jessica, it's a pleasure to have you join us today, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Glenn, and welcome everyone. I wish I could see your faces. I wish we could be together. I hope you're all hanging in there and well, and I look forward to when we can all be in person again. I'd like to just start by thanking the Norton Museum and all of its staff for being such gracious hosts. Being at the Norton, I've been here, I guess, now a month, and I still have a few more weeks. I never want to leave. It's been a wonderful experience. It's been restorative and a time for great creativity and experimentation. I'd especially like to thank Cheryl Brutvan and Rachel Gustafson for their hospitality and all the coordination that they do for the residency. And to Glenn Tomlinson, thank you, Glenn, for that introduction, Kate Faulkner, Gladys Ramirez, and Bobby Marrero for the invitation and for all the coordination they've done behind the scenes to organize this talk tonight. As Glenn mentioned, tonight I'm going to discuss my recent monograph, Road Through Midnight, a Civil Rights Memorial published last year. It did take me over a decade of research and fieldwork, as Glenn mentioned, really focusing on lesser known histories of the Civil Rights era in the American South, really thinking about how to reframe Southern landscapes as sites of both remembrance and resistance, as we know that the fight for civil rights is still going on, and memorialization has become the literal subject of contested cultural and societal ground. I'm just going to give you a short introduction, just to give you a sense of the talk tonight, and I'm going to move you through parts of the book. And then at the end, if there's time, I'm going to show you a couple of public art commissions I did during the span of the book project. And then, as Glenn mentioned, we will have time for some Q&A and conversation between Glenn and myself. So this work started for me in 2002 in downtown Montgomery when I found myself at Court Square, facing an ornate fountain and a historical marker placed next to it. And the Court Square marker had been erected in 2001, and it read, "The city slave market was at Artesian Basin, in parentheses, Court Square. Slaves of all ages were auctioned along with land and livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertised sales and included gender, approximate age, first names, parentheses, slaves did not have last names, skill, price, complexion, and owner's name. In the 1850s, able field hands brought $1,500, skilled artisans $3,000. In 1859, the city had 7 auctioneers and 4 slave depots, one at Market Street in Lawrence, another at the corner of Perry and Monroe, and 2 on Market between Lawrence and McDonough. Now, usually I approach historical markers, and I wonder how you guys feel or if you even stop to look at them. But I stop and look at them to learn something, to read them. But I don't often feel something. And this was very different for me at Court Square because I was deeply impacted by reading this. Not only the brutality of the language, the brutality of the facts of the language, that enslaved peoples were not given last name, that they were auctioned with land and livestock, but also what it means to erase histories. And then I got really curious about what does it mean to bring those histories back, to reemerge into the collective consciousness through historical markers. And this marker was new. It had been put up the year before I was there. So had it not been there, I would have not known that I was standing on the site where enslaved people were once sold and traded. Next slide, please, Bobby. So it led me to questions of what has been left out of the dominant narrative of the civil rights era. What events are unmarked? I began answering this question when I started traveling to collect research, photograph sites, and record oral histories about civil rights era atrocities and resistance to that violence, and stories outside the narratives that I knew and that I felt were more kind of common in terms of historical retelling. So this is an excerpt from a free press. It's referencing, so people here and all over want to know what the MFDP, which is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, finds and does about the murdering of Lee and Allen, about quiet nights and the burning of crosses, the hot days and the green pines. And for me, this, I mean, the kind of the incredible richness of that language, but bringing together this murder, bringing together these people, bringing together also these images of the landscape, the hot nights, the hot days, the green pines, quiet nights, burning of crosses. And this is referring to World War II veteran Lewis Allen, who was murdered on January 31st, 1964. He had witnessed the murder of an NAACP member and a student nonviolent coordinating committee supporter, Herbert Lee. So Herbert Lee was killed by a state legislator, E.H. Hurst, in 1961, and the witness, Lewis Allen, was murdered 3 years later. And that's what this Free Press text is referring to. Next slide. So again, my mission, because the project is these color landscape photographs, archival ephemera. Inside of the book, it's the text from these recorded oral histories. And my mission really was to reframe these rivers, these fields, these homes as markers of struggle. And I was driven to do this project because I wanted to emphasize the resistance to the oppression that took place outside of the populated places, outside of the downtowns and the city centers, away from the eyes of reporters, and the retaliatory, systemic, and often state-sanctioned violence that occurred in response. So I did about 8 oral histories that are included in the book with family members of individuals who were murdered during this period, with cold case investigators that work now, journalists that work now, and with a journalist that worked at the time. And now I'm going to play for you like a 1 minute long trailer for these oral histories. So Bobby, could you please play the first clip?
In 1955, on December 3rd, my father was gunned down. He worked for the service station near Glendora, Mississippi.
What made these cases so bad is not just that these guys got away with murder, but the fact that everybody knew these guys were getting away with murder.
The only thing I remember when the bomb went off, how my mother called and said it was my daddy.
I was going through some changes myself, you know, about where do I really stand on this. And I grew up in this society. It became pretty clear to me what the real issues were, just a matter of human dignity and the rights of a citizen.
So next slide, Bobby. So this is a collage. They said one to another, behold, here cometh the dreamer, let us slay him, and we shall see what become of his dreams, from Genesis. And this is a plaque outside of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, which is now the Civil Rights Museum. And really just wanted to excerpt this text about setting up this opposition between the dreamer, the person wanting more, and the person who's going to try to stop it. Next slide, please. So in 2005, early days in this project, when I was still just trying to figure out what I was looking for and even how to do research around some of this material, I pulled into Midnight, Mississippi, the hometown of a man named Rainey Poole, who was murdered nearby in 1970. And I was greeted by this handmade sign welcoming me. Next slide. And there were these two boys in the road with their bicycles. It was really quiet. And in the relative calm of the scene, watching these two boys play, I thought about the vulnerability of Black bodies in this country, and really thinking back in the civil rights era, thinking about the context of place, and the relationship of place to violence, and really asking, what does it mean to be disappeared from a place as small as Midnight? And how are the reverberations of systemic violence, the direct involvement of law enforcement, the failure of the justice system felt? And what does it mean then, in the face of this lack of justice, to keep working against the repression when you understand the threat of violence and the lack of protection by the state? And that moment really framed a lot of the rest of the project. Next slide. This is the bank of the Sunflower River. And on April 12th, 1970, Rainey Poole, a 54-year-old one-armed sharecropper from Midnight, Mississippi, was beaten by a group of white men and dumped in the Sunflower River. Police found Poole's body 2 days later. 4 men were arrested and charged with assault and murder, one of whom confessed. The charges were dropped after the state court granted a nolle prosequi, a legal declaration in which a prosecutor declines to further pursue a case. In 1999, at the request of the Poole family, the case was reopened. Joe Oliver Watson pled to manslaughter and testified against the other men involved in Poole's murder, which resulted in James Caston, his brother Charles Ernie Caston, and his half-brother Hal Spivey Krem being convicted of manslaughter by a state jury and sentenced to 20 years in prison. So that narrative I just read you is reflective of a lot of the narratives that are in the book, where I'm telling the story of the person, I'm telling the story of what happened, but I'm also talking about what happened regarding justice or the lack of justice. And my undergrad was at NYU was in photography, but it was also in political science. And I really wavered on, am I going to be an artist or am I going to be a lawyer? But one of the things I was most compelled with in my civil liberties and constitutional law classes was the stories that led to to the legislation, the stories that led to the cases. And I really felt like as an artist, I would be given all this freedom to really be telling those stories. And I feel like that got really satisfied in this project, but also kind of explains a lot of my emphasis on justice and on often the lack of justice in many of these cases. So along with the text from the oral histories, there's the text of the narratives. And there's also, next slide, please. There's also a lot of ephemera from archives. There's archives from FBI files. The Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama was very generous opening their files to me for several summers. And I was especially interested in who didn't make it onto their memorial wall and why. Local libraries and researchers were very generous in small counties, just walking in, people helping me access microfilm, journalists who've investigated a lot of these cases, and family members were especially important in sharing pieces of family archive. So now I'm just going to play a short video that gives you a sense of the book and how all this material came together in the book form. So Bobby, could you please play the next clip? Thank you, Bobby. So that gives you a sense of how the book really interweaves the text from the oral histories, these pieces of archives, some of which are really hard to access. And it was really important to me that they are available for the future in this book, as well as the color landscape photographs and the text from the oral histories. Next slide, please. So one of the things I really wanted to figure out was early in the project, when I was just trying to think, I learned a lot about research in this project. And one early question was just wanting to really understand the Klan. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I remember on our little black and white television, seeing Klan rallies being reported in the news in nearby Pulaski, Tennessee. And a lot of my questions just were about, like, how did this organization start? Where did it start? How did it evolve? And so I went to Pulaski just trying to figure this out. And I remembered I had been there before as a photojournalist in the late 90s. And I remembered that there was a record office in the courthouse, or in the city hall. And I went in there, and there was a woman there who ran kind of the archives. And I was kind of hemming and hawing, like, how much do you talk about what you're really interested in when the subject's the Klan? And I asked her, could you, direct me to some research? Could you tell me where I might find a reference? And she was like, honey, do you want me to just draw you a map? And drew me a map to this law office. And there, if you notice on the left, there's a plaque there that has been unbolted and rebolted to the wall backwards. It's illegal to remove a historical marker. And this is such a visual rejection of that history. And the town has done quite a lot to kind of remake its image. But the plaque reads, the Ku Klux Klan organized in this law office of Judge Thomas M. Jones, December 24th, 1865, and it names the 6 original organizers. But also just thinking about what does it mean for us to also just reject that memorial, that kind of marker, that historical marker. Next slide. And just continuing to think about, like, how we remember and how we acknowledge within the landscape, thinking about Emmett Till and his murder in Money, Mississippi. And I don't know if any of you have been to Money, but that site is still really in flux. And so in August, the history of Emmett Till, on August 24th, 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, was dragged from his Uncle Mose Wright's cabin in Money, Mississippi. And he was beaten, he was shot, and he was dumped in the Tallahatchie River by 2 men who accused him of whistling at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant in Bryant's grocery store and meat market in Money. His body was recovered from the river on August 31st, and in that same year, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were acquitted of murder by an all-white jury who deliberated for 67 minutes. The 2 men later confessed to Look magazine in exchange for $3,000. Both men have died, but the Justice Department reopened the case in 2004 to investigate whether anyone else had been involved. No new charges were brought. The case was closed. In 2008, much thanks to the late John Lewis, the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act was signed into law, uniting the FBI and the Department of Justice in investigating civil rights violations that resulted in death before December 31st, 1969. And then in 2008, Carolyn Bryant admitted that she had lied. And she admitted that to author Tim Tyson, that she had made up what happened with Emmett Till, that it was a fabrication. And so in 2018, the Justice Department reopened the case again to investigate this new information. And so the shell of this Bryant store, it's just like the front of it still stands, it's crumbling. And then in 2011, in front of it, the Mississippi Freedom Trail organization placed a historical marker there. And since then, the front of the marker has been repeatedly defaced, the words gouged out with a blunt tool, and the vinyl text and photographs on the reverse have been peeled off, leaving an empty plaque. The sign at the side of the bank of the Tallahatchie River, where Till's body was found, is pierced with bullet holes. So people continue to actively engage with these markers, in some cases literally erasing them. Next slide. Now, this is Medgar Evers' backyard in Jackson, Mississippi, and his house became a memorial to him and the whole house became a historical marker in December of last year, so just a couple of months ago. And just after midnight on June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers, the first field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi, was murdered outside of his home in Jackson, Mississippi. Byron de la Beckwith was tried by all-white juries for the murder in 1963. In 1964, there was abundant evidence, including a fingerprint on the rifle that was left at the scene, but both trials ended in hung juries. Evers led efforts against segregation in academic institutions in Mississippi, including organizing the legal team led by Thurgood Marshall that prevailed in desegregating the University of Mississippi, which made it possible for James Meredith to enroll in 1962. Evers had been denied admission to the University of Mississippi Law School in 1954, the same year the US Supreme Court decided on Brown versus Board of Education. Evers had been receiving death threats, especially after he called for a new investigation into the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till. Investigative reporter Jerry Mitchell, who has an excellent new book out if you want to learn more about these cases, and he's been instrumental in solving and bringing to justice many of these cases. So Jerry Mitchell, who's formerly of the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi, discovered that the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which was a state-run segregationist spy agency. So what that means is it was a state-run agency established just to thwart the civil rights movement and to thwart cases that were brought against violent perpetrators. So Mitchell discovered that the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission was assisting in the defense and Beckwith trials in the 60s. And Myrlie Evers Williams, Medgar Evers' wife, and Mitchell successfully got the case reopened. And Beckwith was convicted with new evidence in 1994 and died in prison in 2001. Now, I want to just read something from Myrlie Evers Williams that I find so still important, kind of drawing us back into the present. So after the conviction of Byron de la Beckwith for killing Medgar Evers, Myrlie Evers said, quote, "Reporters from around the world asked questions. How do you feel, they asked. All I could say was, Medgar, I kept my promise. It took 30 plus years, but I kept my promise. Hopefully others will benefit from that promise as well. The fear, the anger, and the willingness to live a full life, all of those things were coming together, and I felt I have done my job. I kept my promise to Medgar. But my job was not finished because more needed to be done. As we meet here and talk about how to go about it, I have another concern. How do we, who have been there and are dying off now, how do we, those who are the generations behind me and behind them, transfer the dedication, the knowledge, the appreciation of all that has gone on before to a generation now where so many see it as something long ago that does not impact them at all? She goes on to say, we not only have to remember the past, we also have to make the link to the next generation coming along. If we don't, we will find ourselves in another kind of civil war, another kind of horror that we will not know how to take care of. As someone said, community is so important, and we must have a sense of that, protecting our rights, of saying one who has will share with one who does not, and that includes knowledge. And I thought about that text a lot during this project, and I've been especially thinking about it a lot in the last few years. Next slide, please. So I won't read all of these, I do hope if you're interested in these histories that you will take a dive into the book, which for me really satisfied bringing together all of this material. This is the home place of Isaiah Henry. And just in terms of how we understand histories, I want to pause on this one for a moment, because 38-year-old Isaiah Henry, who with his wife Lily helped neighbors prepare to take their voter registration test, was taken violently from his home in Greensburg, Louisiana on July 28, 1954, the day after he had voted himself for the first time. And he was beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. And he suffered brain damage from which he never fully recovered. Neither of the people that did it were indicted. And the case was reopened as part of the Justice Department's cold case initiative, but it was closed in 2012. And the reason was because there had been no violation of federal criminal civil rights statutes, because Isaiah Henry had not been killed and the perpetrators were dead. Additionally, there's a 5-year statute of limitations on non-death violations of federal criminal law. But what some of those, that might seem like kind of minutia, but what some of that means is because he didn't die, he's left out of a lot. You know, Charles Henry often said, like, you're one of the only people that's ever come to talk to me about this. I talked to a reporter who wanted to do more about it, but the death certificate had been lost in Katrina at Charity Hospital. And so you think about all these kind of layers of history that intersect and of law that intersect, and often people will not return to cases. The Justice Department's not going to return to cases where there's no witnesses left, where the perpetrators are dead, where there's very little evidence. They're going to return to cases where they think they can get a conviction. And as time passes, that gets harder and harder to do. And so for me, I really feel like being an artist and thinking about storytelling coming into that gap. So where there can't be justice, the story can still be told. And that's not, you know, necessarily always the most satisfying remedy for the family, but recognition is incredibly important. Next slide, please. This is a picture I took in 2018 of Charles Henry holding a picture of his father. And so as part of the process of this book, especially with the oral histories, after I completed editing the oral histories for clarity, I drove to every single person's house or met them and had them sign off on it, since they were the ones taking their story and their voice in public. And then the other really beautiful thing was before the book came out, I went back and took the book dummy so that they could see it and be okay with it before it was published. And then when the book came out, it was wonderful to drive and deliver the book to them before it was available publicly. Next slide, please. This is the West Side Drive-In in Meadville, Mississippi. 19-year-olds Henry Hezekiah Dee and Charles Eddie Moore were murdered on May 2nd, 1964 by a group of Klansmen led by James Ford Seale, who would later become a police officer, who was a member of a notoriously violent sect of the Klan called the Silver Dollar Group. Dee and Moore were kidnapped and taken to the Homochitto National Forest near Meadville, Mississippi, where they were murdered and thrown into a Mississippi River backwater. Seale was never convicted of the crime, and he was believed dead when many civil rights era cases were being reopened in the 90s. But in 2005, Charles Eddie Moore's brother, Thomas Moore, returned to Mississippi with Canadian filmmaker David Rigdon to make a film about his brother's murder. And while he was there, randomly happened to be like at the BP gas station, ran into a relative and found out that Seale was not dead and was living up the road in a motorhome on family property. And Thomas Moore was able to contact the FBI. The case was reopened. And in August 2007, Seale was convicted on 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of conspiracy and received 3 life sentences and died in prison in 2011. One thing I love about this image is the sign that prayer helps, that kind of as if anticipating the needs of the passerby. Next slide, please. And this one as well, pray for peace. So this is the Armstrong tire and rubber plant in Natchez, Mississippi, where Warless Jackson was murdered, also by the Silver Dollar Group, which is a particularly violent Klan group that was using explosives and operating in the Natchez, Mississippi, Faraday, Louisiana corridor over the Mississippi River. No one has been convicted of that crime either, but Denise Jackson Ford, who is one of my oral histories, Charles Henry, who I mentioned earlier, is also one of the oral histories, and Thomas Moore that I mentioned last slide, the brother that found his brother's murderer, he's also one of the oral histories in the book, as is Jerry Mitchell, the investigative reporter that I mentioned. But so Denise Jackson Ford wrote a piece for the local paper because she kept being told there's a memorial will be put up, a memorial will be put up, and it kept not being. And she wrote a piece in the paper, and the community came together and funded it and got it put up for Warless Jackson on Minor Street, where he lived in Natchez, Mississippi. And that Denise talks about how much that meant to her, because so many of these families are just longing for closure, and they're having to kind of adapt in the absence of closure. And Denise talks about how important that was for closure. But you know, understanding the resistance that took place, understanding the legacy of racial violence and inequality is the foundation upon which to understand the present. And in a few of these images, like seeing Pray for Peace or Prayer Helps, to me, it felt like a call for a response. And they take us who pass by these places, who read this book, out of the past, into the present, and they're really asking us to act and to be really present in that space. Next slide, please. This is the last narrative in the book. It's the last one I'll share tonight as well. It was incredibly important to me in terms of understanding also just how to be a better person and a better artist and a better researcher. And I'll get into that in just a minute. But first, I'll tell you the story of Vernon Damer. He ran a shop and had a home in Kelly Settlement outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He was the president of the NAACP chapter in Hattiesburg, and he was a leader in SNCC. He led the local fight for voting rights. He helped Black voters in Forest County by letting them pay their poll taxes at his store. And he was often quoting a saying, if you don't vote, you don't count. He was murdered on January 10th, 1966 in Kelly Settlement. And the day before, he had offered to pay Black voters poll taxes on the radio. The next day, his home and store were bombed. He threw his family out the window, and he succumbed to his injuries a couple days later. What you see here is 4 of Damer's sons were serving overseas and had protective escort from the airport when they returned for their father's funeral. And this is them looking at what was the former home and store. Next slide. 14 men were arrested in the late 1960s, resulting in several convictions. Samuel Bowers, the Imperial Wizard of the White Knights of Mississippi, and another Klansman were released with hung juries. Bowers, who had already served 6 years in prison for the murders of civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, was retried in 1991 and sentenced to life in prison in 1998 for ordering the murder of Vernon Damer. And Bowers died in prison in 2006. And this fact really points to, as often there were these singular individuals that were leading these groups of Klan sects, the Silver Dollar Group or the White Knights, and they were not held accountable for earlier crimes, or they were given short sentences, and they went on to continue to commit violent acts and murder. Just a real lack of accountability and justice. This is a telegram, as you can see, from Lyndon B. Johnson. Next slide, please, Bobby. And Jerry Mitchell, again, the investigative reporter I mentioned, was instrumental in proving Bowers' involvement in the murder. And if you read his oral history in my book, the way that he got material, like he got the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission files leaked to him, like he was really dogged in trying to get his hands on this material because so much of it had been sealed. And next slide, please. So Damer's wife, Vernon Damer Sr.'s wife, Ellie, erected a memorial on the side of the house and the store with bottles that were found in the wreckage. This is one of my favorite monuments. I just think it's so beautiful. The foundation, the wildflowers, the light catching the bottles that were left. It's so personal and really made for that site. And I think about that a lot as we're engaging in all these questions about memorials, about what stays up, what comes down, and these new questions about how are we going to remember all that we've lost in the last year. Next slide, please. So this is a page from Vernon Damer's funeral program, and this is some of that family archive I was mentioning. And I just find this to be so important for so many reasons. So one, just really thinking about language and thinking about the language we read on historical markers or memorials versus the language of like insiders, of people who knew someone, the language of families, the language of kind of personal memorial. And I think about that here. It says, you know, he was born in Forest County, Mississippi. So he was born in a county named after Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, who was a particularly heinous and violent Klansman. his life was dedicated to the cause of freedom, and he was killed in action. That to me that's such powerful, beautiful language, and that's really insider language. That's not something you would read on a historical marker. You'd be reading the facts. And these are facts, but the language is allowed to be different. And this phrase, his sacrifice on the altar of freedom should inspire us to finish the task, was a phrase that I held with me the entire book. And it's a phrase that I still think about all the time in my work. And those stars, I mean, I really think that his sacrifice on the altar of freedom should inspire us to finish the task. It runs through the book like a road. And I got this piece, and I learned so much about Vernon Dahmer Sr. from his son, Vernon Dahmer Jr. And that was such a powerful experience. And you'll notice, like, as a design element, those stars on here are repeated throughout the book as like these kind of benchmarks, and they're repeated inside in exactly the same place in the book as they are on that program, just to kind of unite and bring you back to that. But the story I want to tell about Vernon Dahmer Jr. is I kept trying to talk to him about the work, and I kept trying to talk to him about what happened to his father. And when the first times I talked to him, he told me his story was not for sale, and he wouldn't talk to me. And I kept trying back, and eventually Jerry Mitchell gave me a reference as Jerry and I became friends. And Mr. Dahmer decided to meet with me. But I really keep thinking about that phrase, my story is not for sale. And especially as we're thinking about anti-racism these days and just how transactional we can get. To just try to wrap something up or get what we need or check the boxes. And that's what he was really pointing to with that story. My story is not for sale. This is not going to be a transaction where you want something and you want it from me and I'm going to give it to you. It's going to require more than that. It's going to require that I had more at stake in this work. It's going to require that I had more experience and knowledge. It's going to require more time. It's going to require trust and relationships. And I found that was what I learned really in this work, which was an incredibly valuable gift to have. So let's see. Oh, next slide, please. This was really lovely. In 2018, the artist-run group For Freedoms, which is a huge nationwide collaboration, artistic collaboration led by Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Godesman, asked me to participate in their 50 States project, which was artists putting billboards in 50 states in fall of 2018. And to get out the vote. And so I made this billboard outside of Jackson, Mississippi that says, "Vote for Vernon." And Vernon Dahmer gave his life for voting rights and didn't get to cast a ballot himself. And what that's referencing is Vernon Dahmer Sr. did all of this work to help people register to vote. And he never got to cast the ballot himself. His voter registration card arrived a couple weeks after his death. So let's see, it's 6:40. I'm actually going to stop there and not show the Public Art Commission work, just so that we're sure we have time for, maybe I'll show 5 minutes. So you guys start thinking about your questions and you can put them in the comments in a minute. And in the meantime, Bobby, why don't we skip video 3 and let's go, not yet, but in just a minute to this video 4. So this is the Long March. And so as an artist working on a project like Road Through Midnight for such a long time, I was really fortunate to work with a collaborative group called the Cause Collective, which I'm a member of, with the artist Hank Willis Thomas, the designer Ryan Alexiev, and we've also worked with the artist Baite Ross Smith and the late ethnographer, activist, and artist Jorge Sanchez. And one of the great projects we got to do was for the state of Alabama. In the middle of me doing all this work, we were commissioned to make a video sculptural wall for the new terminal of the Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport. And so, oh, next slide, please. Sorry, Bobby. Actually, keep going. Keep going. That one. So what you're looking at here is a 70-foot long video wall with compositions that we created that feed from the right and the, oh, this is backwards, but the right and the left into the center and get remixed in this kaleidoscope. And we decided to really consider, it's called the Long March. So we really thought of the march as a historical progression, a march as an act, but also an act of resistance, a facilitator of change. But we also looked at, drum lines and civil rights era marches, of course. And we looked at the history of Alabama, whether it's Steele, Tuskegee Institute, religion. You'll see, if you'll play the video number 4, please, Bobby, and we'll just show a short clip of this work so you can have a sense of my public art practice as well. Thank you, Bobby, for playing that. So, what you might have noticed some images in there, Martin Luther King, of course, Fred Shuttlesworth. You might have noticed the infamous image of George Wallace blocking the schoolhouse door in the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. But then we found these incredible photo archives related to the Tuskegee Institute, these old panoramic plates. I shot a lot of contemporary or current video portraits of people that I would just meet, spending time in Alabama. And we put this piece together. So it's a wonderful way of, again, of kind of a through line in my practice of thinking about the current moment, of who's there, of who's impacted, but also how do we bring in archive? How do we unite the past to the present and think about these through lines as we craft a way forward? So with that, I will stop and welcome Glenn back. And I just want to thank Bobby Marrero, who's behind the scenes here, for cueing all the AV. Thank you, Bobby. So Glenn, you want to rejoin?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. What a powerful and moving body of work that you shared with us tonight.
Thank you.
I do want to invite our listeners to add comments or questions. We do have a couple. Rhonda has written that the book is very powerful. I read it a few days ago and couldn't sleep that night. Thank you for bringing this to light. And
Thank you.
I was wondering if there in this incredible journey that you've taken through this project, is there one experience during the creation of this body of work that was perhaps most moving or inspiring for you, Jessica? Maybe you've already described it, but
yeah, I mean, yeah, gosh, there's so many. I mean, the time with Vernon Damer Jr. was so influential for me. But I think also the most moving for me was being in a relationship with the family members, for sure. And because that was not something that happened instantly. I worked on this project for a long time, making these images, doing research, traveling around. And like I said, like I really had to learn how to do research on this project. And for a while, I would try to Google things, and I would get myself, because there just wasn't a lot of material available yet. And so I was driving to literally dig up microfilm, look at old newspapers, and asking family members, and also in my subject position as a white artist making this work, going and asking Black family members to recount trauma is a really intense thing to do. And it has to be done carefully and with a lot of sensitivity and with a lot of preparedness. And it also has to happen after there's been trust built and relationship built. And so I didn't do these oral histories until the very end of the project. And at that time, I had, seen and met with some of these family members for quite a while. And so, or at least been in touch and kept them informed. And so maybe the most satisfying thing, and I'm going to try not to get choked up saying this, was taking the book back at the end. And Denise Jackson Ford just crying, because she was hard on me at the beginning. She was not letting me in. And I really also wanted some more women in the book. And so I just really really cared about her voice and the way, I really wanted her story in the book. And she was just crying, and she just kept saying, "You've done good. You've done good." I think when I got that felt like so much validation. And then, also having, not to say the most powerful thing was me feeling validated, not to just make this all about me, but I think, the other thing that was just people, I didn't totally understand what it meant to bring all these stories together. But there's so many people out there who are working so hard on these stories. They're working hard on keeping them present and remembered in their communities. They're working hard on investigating them. And so it was really nice to realize the impact of bringing them all together, to positioning some of these stories within this greater context of what was happening regionally. And this is a Southern story, but we all know that this kind of violence and racism was happening all over the country. But just kind of positioning all these together and realizing that had power. And it helped. It even, I think, was good for individuals that are working on these separate things to start to see, oh, my story fits into this larger story, which, now we're all becoming much more aware of that. But yeah, those are some rewarding moments. But I would say, I had a lot to learn, and I learned a lot. And the family members taught me a lot, and I'm grateful for that. And Jerry Mitchell, and the journalist Stanley Nelson and Stanley Dearman, all the oral histories in the book. But I would say one of the most impactful things that really changed how I do research and how I approach being an artist that works inside of communities was Vernon Damer, the story I told about Vernon Damer.
Yeah. The images are powerful in and of themselves, but the stories obviously lend layer upon layer of context and meaning to these images that you've produced. And you're obviously really sensitive to language and how that evokes feeling and meaning. I was just wondering how you think about the relationship of these images and the text. Just because it obviously, when you're putting together a book project like this, that relationship is critical, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit of insight into how you think through that kind of, maybe it's an editorial process.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. That's a great question. And it's making me visualize being back in my studio, shifting and moving. And, at the beginning I was really attached, the images have to have the text next to them. And as soon as I let that go and started thinking about the images and then thinking about the text, it freed me up. And so in many cases, you'll notice looking at, that short video of the book, or if you look at the book, all the images most of the images are full bleed, except for images of memorials and markers. They're around more of a 4x5 size. And then there's some images that are a little bit, I did include kind of microfilm of the Emmett Till issue of Jet magazine, where Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, decided to publish his body, and how much that kind of galvanized support and additional resistance, especially. And so that is actually the size of Jet. But the photographs that I made are all full bleed, and there's no page numbers, there's no index, there's rarely text with image, because I really wanted you to feel like you were literally traveling through, that you were kind of meandering through this landscape and understanding the impact of what's happened here. And so while, yes, the images and the text are very much related, I'm not necessarily completely reliant on you making those connections. Even though I feel like I have designed the book with my designer Liz Moran to make those connections, so that it does kind of flow. But there are also stories in there that don't have the image with them. There's stories in there that are sometimes told through a piece of archive. So once I kind of freed myself up, and this maybe is like getting in the weeds of editorial process, but that helps. And there's some landscape images, because a book, you have the power of using layout and sequencing to really think about pacing. And as the person generously just gave feedback about the book, it's a difficult read, and you need pacing. And so there's images that have that don't have anything like directly attached to them. They're really just about providing the context and the kind of interstitial and this pace, so that you occasionally have a break and the sun sets in the middle of the book, and then you start again and it sets again at the end.
Thank you for kind of exploring that with us.
Sure.
I appreciate that, because
Sure.
the relationship between word and text obviously is so critical. Do you think that this project, Road Through Midnight, has continues to shape the way you think about your art?
Oh, certainly. Yes, I'm forever changed. I see everything through the lens of civil rights and what I have learned. I mean, I think some questions that I have coming out of this work. I mean, I feel like whenever you do work about, well, I shouldn't say this. Me doing this work about the civil rights era, it immediately leads me to two areas: the justice system and incarceration, the carceral system, and the education system. And I think one thing that I hope is so clear in this book is that we have to go back and look at these systems that have been created, that were created to uphold white supremacy. And they were created through incredible violence. But that violence has permeated, and that's why the court cases are so important. It's permeated into the justice system. It's permeated into the education system. And so those are two areas I think a lot about right now. And one thing I'm thinking about in particular is this idea of how do we care for one another within community. And that's a big thing we're thinking about anyway right now with COVID, because there's a lot of like the individual versus the collective that we're going to have to wrestle with after this, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm feeling on shaky ground. So in terms of how I can understand, I'm having to rethink what the collective is, because I think we're seeing some instances where maybe the collective is not as collective as we thought. And so that's one thing I think a lot about, is in the idea of communities of care. And I did a couple other projects during this, and one was at a high school in Georgia, in a JROTC program. I've done another project in a high school for pregnant teenagers in San Francisco, and really thinking about care and how we tell those stories of care. I'm also really thinking about language right now and how we deploy language. And I'm working a lot with text right now in different ways than I've worked with before.
Jessica, I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, and for the powerful work that you do, but also just the the great thoughtfulness that you bring to it and have shared with us tonight. It's wonderful. And we hope that the Artist in Residency program that you're having right now is a productive time for you.
Oh, it's truly been incredible, and I'm just grateful every day for it. It's really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join us again in 2 weeks on March 18th. We'll be joined by Tim Ride, the William and Sarah Ross Soder Curator of Photography. He'll join us to introduce his new exhibition from the permanent collection entitled When? A Brief History of the Relationship Between Time and Photography. Until then, thank you so much for joining us, and be well.